Every morning, a humble girl knelt outside the saloon, polishing a cowboy's dusty boots for a single coin. She never asked his name, just smiled and worked in silence. To her, he was just another wanderer passing through town. But what she didn't know was that the man whose boots she scrubbed didn't just walk these streets, he owned every inch of them. And soon, her kindness would rewrite her fate forever. Not the kind that whispers through tall grass or rattles loose shutters. This wind clawed. It tore across the flats with the hunger of something that had traveled too far and found nothing worth keeping. Copper Bend sat low in the basin, a collection of weathered buildings that had long stopped trying to look like a town. The paint had peeled years ago, the signs swung crooked, and when the dust rolled in, thick and brown as old blood, the streets emptied like a held breath. Clara Wynne didn't run. She crouched beneath the saloon's porch, arms wrapped tight around her knees, her bare feet pressed into the cool dirt. 11 years old, and already she knew the rhythm of storms. The way the air went still just before the wind hit. The way the sky turned copper. The way people disappeared behind doors that didn't open for girls like her. The storm struck hard. Dust filled the air so thick she could taste it. Grit between her teeth, burning in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her face against her knees, waiting. The wind screamed through the empty street, rattling the saloon's boards, sending a broken wagon wheel tumbling past. Somewhere a horse whinnied, sharp and panicked. Then she heard it, a low, wet thud. Clara lifted her head, squinting through the swirling brown haze. Across the street, barely visible through the storm, a horse stood trembling in the middle of the road. Its head hung low, foam dripping from its mouth. And slumped in the saddle, barely holding on, was a man. His hat was gone. His coat hung open, torn at the shoulder. One hand gripped the saddle horn, white, knuckled. The other dangled loose at his side. The horse took another step and buckled. Clara's breath caught. The man didn't fall, he slid. Slow, heavy, landing on his side in the dust. The horse collapsed beside him, chest heaving, eyes rolling white. For a moment, Clara didn't move. The storm howled around her, the world reduced to wind and dust and the shape of a stranger lying in the street. She'd seen men fall before. She'd seen them carried out of the saloon, drunk or dead, hauled away by friends or left where they dropped. But this man, something about the way he lay there, still as stone, made her heart kick hard against her ribs. She should stay hidden. She knew that. Girls like hers, skinny, barefoot, no mother, no home, didn't run toward trouble. They stayed small, stayed quiet, stayed alive, but the wind screamed and the man didn't move, and Clara's feet were already carrying her forward. The dust stung her eyes as she ran, head down, arms up to shield her face. The storm pushed against her like a living thing, but she pressed through it, stumbling across the street until she reached the man. Up close, she could see the blood, dark and wet across his ribs, soaking through his shirt. His face was turned away half, buried in the dirt. "Mister," she whispered, but the wind swallowed her voice. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands shaking. She'd never touched a dying man before. Never been this close to someone who might not wake up. But she reached out anyway, fingers brushing his shoulder, and when she shook him gently, he didn't stir. The horse groaned, a sound so human it made Clara flinch. She looked at the animal, its eyes wide and terrified, its legs folded beneath it. It wasn't dying, just exhausted, ridden too hard, too far. She could see the sweat, streaked coat, the foam around its mouth. This horse had carried the man through something worse than the storm. Clara turned back to the stranger. She couldn't lift him, couldn't drag him, but she could move his boots. They were beautiful boots. Even covered in dust and blood, she could see it. The smooth, black leather, polished to a shine. Silver spurs hung from the heels, intricate and gleaming even in the storm's dim light. These weren't the boots of a drifter. These were the boots of someone who mattered. She grabbed hold of one boot and pulled. The man groaned. Clara froze, heart hammering, but he didn't wake. Just a low sound, barely human, dragged from somewhere deep. She pulled again, harder this time, dragging him inch by inch across the dirt. The storm battered her, dust filling her mouth, her lungs, but she kept pulling. One boot, then the other. One step, then another. The stable door hung open just ahead, swinging wild in the wind. Clara aimed for it, muscles burning, breath coming in short gasps. She didn't know why she was doing this, didn't know if it mattered, but something in her, something stubborn and small and fear, refused to leave him lying in the street. She hauled him through the doorway and collapsed. Inside, the storm was muffled. Dust still swirled through the cracks in the walls, but the wind's scream faded to a distant howl. Clara lay on the floor beside the man, chest heaving, her hands shaking so hard she had to press them flat against the dirt to stop them. When she finally sat up, the man was still unconscious. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Blood seeped through his shirt, pooling in the dust beneath him. She should get help. She should find someone, anyone, who knew what to do. But the storm still raged outside, and Clara knew better than to expect help. She crawled closer, studying him in the dim light. His face was hard, weathered. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pale and jagged. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples. He wasn't old, but he looked like he'd lived too much. She reached for his coat, meaning to pull it closed, to stop the bleeding somehow. But when her fingers brushed the fabric, she felt something hard beneath it. A revolver. Clara hesitated, then carefully pulled the coat open. The gun sat in a worn leather holster, strapped tight across his chest. The metal gleamed dull in the low light, and etched along the barrel, so fine she almost missed it, were words. Property of Copper Bend. Clara's breath caught. She stared at the engraving, her mind racing. Property of Copper Bend. She'd never seen a gun marked like that. Never seen anything in this town worth claiming. Copper Bend was dying. Had been dying for as long as she could remember. The ranch hands had left. The mines had closed. The families had packed up and gone, leaving behind empty houses and empty dreams. So why did this man carry a gun with the town's name on it? She sat back, staring at him. The boots, the spurs, the revolver. This wasn't some drifter blown in by the storm. This was someone who belonged here, or used to. Outside, thunder cracked, low and rolling, shaking the stable's frame. The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. Clara wiped the dust from his coat as best she could, her hands gentle despite their trembling. She found a saddle blanket in the corner and spread it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something. She settled beside him, knees pulled to her chest, and watched his face in the dim light. His breathing was still shallow, still uneven, but he was breathing. The storm howled. The stable creaked, and in the silence between the thunder's cracks, Clara wondered who he was, and why he'd ridden alone into a town that had forgotten kindness. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time moved strange in the dark. Clara dozed, head against the stable wall, jerking awake every time the wind rattled the door. Each time, she checked the man's breathing. Each time, he was still alive. The storm began to fade as the sun sank somewhere beyond the dust. The wind died down to a low moan, and the dust settled, drifting through the cracks like powdered snow. Clara stood, legs stiff, and crept to the doorway. Outside, Copper Bend lay silent. The street was empty. The building stood dark. A few lanterns flickered in windows, but no one came out. No one checked to see if anyone had been caught in the storm. That was the way of it here. Everyone looked after their own, and no one looked after her. Clara turned back to the man. He still hadn't opened his eyes. She knelt beside him and carefully pulled off his boots, setting them beside the wall. The leather was cracked and scuffed, but underneath the dust, they were well made. Expensive. She ran her fingers over the silver spurs, tracing the intricate design. Whoever he was, he'd once had money. Maybe still did. She found a rag in the corner and dampened it with water from an old bucket. Gently, she wiped the blood from his face, the dust from his hands. His fingers were calloused, rough, working hands, but his nails were clean, his palms scarred in the way of someone who'd spent years holding reins and ropes. When she finished, she sat back and studied him. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man didn't answer, but somewhere in the silence, Clara felt a shift, a change in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. She didn't know what it meant, didn't know if it meant anything at all. But as the last light faded and the stable sank into darkness, she stayed beside him. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. Night fell heavy over Copper Bend. The stars came out sharp and cold, pinpricks of light in a sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Inside the stable, Clara curled up on the floor, the saddle blanket pulled over her shoulders. She kept one eye on the man, watching his chest rise and fall in the darkness. She didn't sleep. Not really. Just drifted, half aware, listening to the sounds of the night. The creak of the stable, the rustle of mice in the rafters, the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out on the flats. And then, in the deepest part of the night, the man stirred. Clara's eyes snapped open. He didn't wake. Just shifted slightly, his hand twitching, his breath catching. She watched, heart pounding, as his face twisted. Pain or memory, she couldn't tell. Then he went still again. Clara exhaled slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, soft and cold, carrying with it the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. The storm had passed, but something else was coming. She could feel it. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the stable walls, the man still hadn't opened his eyes, but Clara sat beside him, waiting, because she'd pulled him from the storm. And in a town like Copper Bend, that meant something, even if she didn't know what yet. The sun rose slow and pale, painting the horizon in shades of rust and gold. Clara stood at the stable door, watching the town wake. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. A rooster crowed somewhere down the street. The saloon's door swung open, and a man stumbled out, squinting in the early light. Life went on, as if nothing had happened. As if a stranger hadn't nearly died in the street. Clara glanced back at the man. He lay exactly as she'd left him. Coat still spread over his chest. Boots beside the wall. The blood on his shirt had dried to a dark stain. He needed a doctor, needed help, but she didn't move. Because something inside her, something she couldn't name, told her that the moment people knew he was here, everything would change. So she stayed. And she waited. And when the town finally noticed the horse standing alone in the street, saddle empty, reins dragging in the dust, when they came looking, Clara stood in the doorway of the stable and met their eyes without flinching. "He's alive," she said quietly, "but he ain't waking yet." The men stared at her. Then at the man lying in the shadows behind her. One of them, a tall man with a badge pinned to his vest, stepped forward, his face hard. "Who is he?" Clara didn't answer, because she didn't know. But as the sheriff pushed past her and knelt beside the stranger, his face went pale. He stared at the man's face, at the scar, at the revolver still holstered across his chest. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Illy Mercer." The name hung in the air like smoke. Clara's heart kicked hard. She didn't know who Illy Mercer was, but from the look on the sheriff's face, she knew one thing for certain. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The light came thin and uncertain through the stable's broken shutters, cutting the floor into stripes of gold and shadow. Clara sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, watching the man Illy Mercer. The sheriff had called him. As his chest rose and fell in the fragile rhythm of sleep that wasn't quite rest. The coffee she'd brewed sat cooling in a chipped tin cup beside her. She'd made it weak, had to. The grounds were old, borrowed from the saloon's back room when no one was looking, stretched thin with twice boiled water. But it was hot, and it smelled like something close to comfort, and that was enough. Outside, the town was waking slow. Boots on boardwalks, the clatter of a wagon, voices low and careful, the way people talk when they're not sure who's listening. They'd been talking all night. Clara had heard them through the stable walls. The sheriff and his men, gathered on the porch of the saloon, their words drifting on the cold air like smoke. She'd caught pieces, fragments, enough to know that the man lying in the hay wasn't just a stranger. He was a ghost, a name people thought they'd buried. She studied his face in the morning light. The scar looked paler now, a ridge of old violence cutting from temple to jaw. His hair was dark where it wasn't gray, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than the hard lines of his face suggested. His hands lay still at his sides, scarred knuckles, calloused palms, the hands of someone who'd worked and fought and held on too long to things that should have been let go. He stirred. Clara tensed, but didn't move. His eyelids flickered. His breathing changed, deeper, uneven, dragging himself up from wherever he'd been. Then his eyes opened, gray eyes, storm, colored, watchful. He didn't move at first, just stared at the rafters above him, blinking slowly, as if trying to remember where he was or how he'd gotten there. Then his gaze shifted, tracking across the stable, taking in the walls, the door, the light, before finally landing on Clara. They stared at each other. She waited for him to speak, to ask where he was, who she was, what had happened, but he didn't. He just looked at her, silent and steady, like he was reading something written on her face that she didn't know was there. Finally, she picked up the tin cup and held it out. "It ain't much," she said quietly, "but it's hot." He looked at the cup, then back at her. Slowly, he pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing as the movement pulled at his ribs. Clara saw the flash of pain cross his face, quick and sharp, before he buried it. He reached for the cup, his hand steady despite everything, and took it from her without a word. He drank, not fast, just slow, deliberate sips, his eyes half closed. When he finished, he handed the cup back and nodded once. Brief but clear, "Thank you." His voice was low, rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Clara set the cup down. "You were in the street. Storm nearly killed you." "Nearly," he repeated, almost to himself. He glanced toward the door, toward the light spilling in. "How long?" "Day and a half. You didn't wake." He absorbed that without reaction, just nodded again and looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slowly, testing them. "Your horse is all right," Clara added, tied out back. "Someone brought it water. Someone. Me." His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment something flickered there, surprise maybe, or something softer. But it passed before she could name it. "You've got a name?" he asked. "Clara Wynne." "Clara." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. Then he looked around the stable again, taking in the hay bales, the broken tools, the saddle blanket she'd covered him with. "This your place?" She shook her head. "Nobody's place. Not anymore." He nodded, understanding without needing more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a rooster crowed. The sound of hammering started up somewhere down the street. Steady, rhythmic. The kind of sound that meant work and normalcy, and a world that kept turning whether you were part of it or not. Illy shifted, preparing to stand, but Clara saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand pressed against his ribs. "You're hurt," she said. "I'll manage. You got a hole in your side." He glanced down at his shirt, at the dark stains spreading across the fabric. "Ain't the first. Don't mean you should stand on it." A faint smile ghosted across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "You always this stubborn. You always this stupid." The smile came again, a little stronger this time. He settled back against the wall, conceding, "Fair point." Clara stood and crossed to the corner where she'd stashed a few things. A strip of cloth she'd torn from an old flour sack. A jar of something that might have been salve once, back when it was fresh. She brought them over and knelt beside him. "Ain't a doctor," she said, "but I can clean it." Illy watched her for a moment, then slowly unbuttoned his shirt. The wound wasn't as bad as the blood had made it look. Deep grays along his ribs, angry and red, but not festering. She'd seen worse, done worse, trying to keep herself alive. She worked in silence, her hands gentle but sure, cleaning the wound with water and wrapping it with the cloth. Illy didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just sat there, watching her with those storm gray eyes, like he was trying to figure out why a girl with no shoes and no home would bother saving a man she didn't know. When she finished, she tied off the bandage and sat back. "Why'd you come back?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, surprised. "They've been talking," she explained. "The sheriff, the men, they know who you are." Illy's expression darkened. He turned his gaze toward the door, toward the town beyond. "What they say, that you're supposed to be dead, that you left years ago, that your family," she hesitated. "That my family what? That they burned." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, like something living and dark had filled the space between them. Illy didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the far wall, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists against his knees. Clara wished she hadn't said it. Wished she could take the words back, but they hung there now, settling into the cracks in the walls, becoming part of the stable's stillness. Finally, Illy exhaled, slow and controlled, like he was letting go of something he'd been holding too long. "They did," he said quietly, "burned to nothing, house, land, cattle, everything, and you left. I was 16. His voice was flat, empty. "They said I started it, said I killed my own father for the inheritance." Clara stared at him. "Did you?" He looked at her then, and the weight in his eyes was answer enough. No. She believed him. Maybe she shouldn't have. Maybe it was foolish to trust a man she'd known for less than 2 days, a man with a gun and a scar and a past full of smoke and accusations. But something in the way he said it simple, tired, like he'd stopped trying to convince people years ago, made her believe him anyway. "Then why'd you come back?" she asked again. Illy leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "Because I'm tired of running." The day stretched long and quiet. Illy didn't try to stand again, just sat there, resting, his breathing steady but shallow. Clara stayed nearby, not speaking, just watching the light move across the floor, marking time in the way it shifted from gold to white to the soft amber of afternoon. Around midday, she slipped out to find food. The saloon's back door was unlocked, as it always was. She crept inside, moving through the dim hallway to the kitchen, where the cook left scraps for the dogs. She found half a loaf of bread, hard but edible, and a few strips of dried meat wrapped in paper. She stuffed them in her pockets and left as quietly as she'd come. When she returned to the stable, Illy was awake, staring at the door. "Thought you ran," he said. "Thought about it." She handed him the bread and meat. He took them without question, eating slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. When he finished, he wiped his hands on his pants and looked at her. "You don't got to stay." "I know." "Then why are you?" Clara shrugged. "Ain't got anywhere else to be." It was true, and they both knew it. But it was also more than that. Something about him. About the way he'd thanked her for weak coffee. About the way he'd looked at her like she mattered. Made her want to stay. Made her feel like maybe she wasn't as small as the world kept telling her she was. Illy seemed to understand. He didn't push, just nodded and turned his attention to the stable door, where a shadow had appeared in the frame. Clara tensed. The sheriff stepped inside. He was tall, broad, shouldered, with a face carved from stone and eyes that didn't miss much. His badge caught the light as he moved, glinting dull silver. He stopped a few feet from Illy, thumbs hooked in his belt, and looked down at him with something close to disgust. "Illy Mercer," he said slowly, "thought you were dead." Disappointed, the sheriff's jaw tightened. "You got nerve coming back here." "It's my town, Garrett. Was your town. Ain't nothing here for you now." Illy met his gaze without flinching. "That's so." Garrett's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Illy. "You're scaring the girl." "She don't look scared to me." The sheriff studied Clara for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Illy, his voice dropping low and cold. "You stay out of sight. You stay quiet. And when you're healed enough to ride, you leave. Understand?" Illy didn't answer. Garrett stepped closer, his shadow falling over them. "I ain't asking." "Then don't." For a moment, Clara thought the sheriff might draw his gun, might end it right there, quick and clean, and call it justice. But he didn't. He just stared at Illy, his face hard, before turning and walking out without another word. The stable fell silent again. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Illy looked at her. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "He won't hurt you," Illy said quietly. "Not while I'm here." And when you leave, he didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. When he left, she'd be alone again. The afternoon faded into evening, the light turning soft and gold as the sun sank low. Clara found an old broom in the corner and started sweeping, just to have something to do. The motion was soothing, rhythmic, mindless, letting her thoughts drift without landing anywhere too heavy. Illy watched her for a while, then stood. Clara glanced over, frowning. "You shouldn't, I know." But he stood anyway, moving slow and careful, one hand pressed against his ribs. He crossed to the stable door and looked out at the town, at the empty street, the crooked buildings, the long shadows stretching across the dust. "Place hasn't changed much," he said quietly. Clara set the broom aside and joined him. "Were you happy here before?" He thought about that. "I don't know. Maybe. Feels like a long time ago." "Do you remember it, being happy?" He glanced down at her, something sad and distant in his eyes. "Sometimes." They stood there together, watching the light fade, neither of them speaking. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. An understanding, fragile and new, but real. When the last light slipped below the horizon, and the stars began to prick the sky, Illy turned from the door. He crossed to the broken latch Clara had noticed days ago, the one that never quite closed right. He knelt, examining it, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small knife. Clara watched as he worked, carving a notch in the wood, adjusting the angle, testing the fit. It took him 20 minutes, maybe more, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finished, the latch clicked into place. Solid, secure holding. He stood, testing it once more, then nodded to himself. Clara stared at him. "Why'd you do that?" He slid the knife back into his coat. "Because it was broken." It was such a simple answer, such a small thing. But as Clara lay down that night on the hay beside the wall, the stable door latched tight for the first time in years. She felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. Outside, the wind picked up, soft and cold, carrying with it the distant sound of voices. Low, deliberate, edged with anger. The town was talking again. And Clara knew, as she pulled the saddle blanket over her shoulders and closed her eyes, that the quiet wouldn't last. But for now, in the darkness of the stable, with the door latched and the man breathing steady in the corner, she let herself believe it might. Just for a little while longer. Morning came soft and pale, the kind of light that didn't push, just settled gentle over everything like dust. Clara woke to the sound of metal on metal, a rhythmic clink that pulled her from sleep, slow and easy. She blinked, disoriented for a moment, then sat up. Illy stood outside the stable door, silhouetted against the dawn. He had a fence post braced against his knee and a hammer in his hand, driving nails into splintered wood with careful, measured strikes. His shirt hung open at the collar, the bandage visible beneath, but his movements were steady, deliberate. Clara stood and walked to the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Thought you were supposed to be resting," she said. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at the fence. "Can't rest and let things fall apart at the same time. Ain't your job to fix it. Ain't anybody else's either." He had a point. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. The fence ran along the side of the stable, separating it from an empty paddock that hadn't seen horses in years. Most of the posts had rotted through, and the ones still standing leaned at angles that defied gravity. It was a losing battle, trying to save it. But Illy worked anyway, replacing what he could, straightening what he couldn't. Clara watched the way he moved, slow but not weak, tired but not broken, like a man who'd learned that survival wasn't about speed, just about not stopping. "You hungry?" she asked after a while. "Always." She disappeared back into the stable and returned with the last of the bread from yesterday. It was stale now, hard enough to hurt your teeth if you weren't careful. She handed him half and kept the rest for herself, and they ate in silence, standing in the cool morning air, watching the town wake around them. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A woman in a faded dress came out of the general store, carrying a basket, her head down as she hurried past without looking their way. "They're afraid of you," Clara said quietly. Illy wiped crumbs from his hands. "They should be afraid of themselves." "What's that mean?" He didn't answer right away. Just set the hammer down and looked out at the town. Really looked like he was seeing through the buildings to something underneath. Something older. Means people don't like being reminded of what they did, he said finally, or what they didn't do. Clara thought about that. About the way the sheriff had looked at Illy. About the whispers she'd heard through the walls. About the way no one had come to check on them since that first morning. "You think they know you didn't do it?" she asked. "What they said you did. Some of them." Illy picked up the hammer again, turning it over in his hands. But knowing and admitting are different things. He went back to work, and Clara stayed beside him, not helping exactly, just present. After a while, she started gathering the broken pieces of wood he'd discarded, stacking them in a pile. It gave her something to do, made her feel useful. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew warm. Sweat began to bead on Illy's forehead, darkening the collar of his shirt, but he didn't stop. Clara fetched water from the pump behind the saloon, cold and metallic, tasting but wet, and brought it back in a dented pail. Illy drank deep, then poured the rest over his head, letting it run down his neck and soak into his shirt. "You're gonna tear that wound open," Clara said, "probably. And then you'll bleed all over the fence you're trying to fix." He looked at her, water dripping from his hair. "You got a better idea." She shrugged. "Could let it stay broken." "Could." He wiped his face with his sleeve. "But then what's the point?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. So she just picked up another broken post and added it to the pile. By midday, they'd made progress. Not much. The paddock still looked half dead, the fence still leaned. But it was something. Illy stepped back, surveying their work, and nodded to himself like he'd settled an argument no one else had heard. "Good enough," he said. "For what? For now." He walked over to the water pump and worked the handle, splashing his face and arms, washing away the dust and sweat. Clara sat on an overturned crate nearby, watching him. He moved different now than he had yesterday, slower but more sure, like his body was remembering what it used to know. When he finished, he straightened and looked toward the far end of the paddock, where 3 horses stood in the shade of a dying cottonwood tree. They were old horses, thin and tired, their coats dull with neglect. No one had claimed them in years. No one had ridden them. They just stood there day after day, waiting for something that wasn't coming. Illy walked toward them. Clara followed. The horses didn't spook when Illy approached, just lifted their heads, ears forward, watching him with dark, patient eyes. He stopped a few feet away and stood there, not moving, letting them decide. The nearest horse, a gray mare with white around her muzzle, took a step forward, then another. She stretched her neck out, nostrils flaring, and sniffed Illy's outstretched hand. He didn't move, just waited. The mare lipped at his palm, then blew out a soft breath and lowered her head. Illy ran his hand along her neck, slow and gentle, his fingers finding the places where the harness had rubbed her coat thin. The mare leaned into his touch, eyes half closed, and for a moment the world went quiet. Clara watched, something tightening in her chest. "You're good with them," she said softly. "Used to work the drives," Illy said, not looking away from the mare. "Before everything, you miss it, sometimes." He moved to the second horse, a bay gelding with a scar across his shoulder. The gelding snorted but didn't pull away. "Mostly, I miss the quiet. Ain't much quieter than here." "No." He glanced at her. "But it's a different kind of quiet." Clara thought she understood. There was the quiet of being alone, which was just emptiness. And then there was the quiet of being with someone who didn't need you to fill the silence. That was the kind that felt like peace. They spent the rest of the afternoon with the horses. Illy found an old brush in the stable and worked through the tangles in their manes, picking out burrs and smoothing the matted hair. Clara fetched fresh water and scattered the last handfuls of grain she'd found in a forgotten barrel. It wasn't much, but the horses ate like it was a feast. By the time the sun began to sink, the horses looked almost alive again. Their coats had a little more shine, their heads hung a little less heavy, and when Illy stepped back, they followed him. Not far, just a few steps, like they didn't want him to go. Clara saw the way his expression softened, saw the way his hand lingered on the gray mare's neck. "They remember you," she said. Illy didn't answer, but something in his eyes said she was right. Evening fell cool and gentle, the sky turning shades of amber and rose. Clara and Illy sat outside the stable on a pair of old crates, the kind of comfortable silence settling between them that didn't need words. The horses grazed nearby, their shapes dark against the fading light. From somewhere in town, a harmonica started playing. The sound drifted across the empty streets, low, mournful, a melody that felt like it had traveled a long way and still hadn't found where it was going. Clara tilted her head, listening. "That's Hank," she said. "Plays every night, always the same song." Illy listened, his gaze distant. "I know that song." "Yeah, my father used to play it." He was quiet for a moment. "Before?" Clara didn't ask what before meant. She already knew. They sat there as the music played on, winding through the cooling air, mixing with the sound of crickets and the soft shuffle of the horses. And in that quiet, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt safe, not because the world had changed, not because anything had been fixed, but because for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't facing it alone. "Why'd you stay?" Illy asked suddenly. Clara looked at him. "What, yesterday, when the sheriff came, you could have left, could have told him everything, could have," he stopped, searching for words, "could have made it easier on yourself." Clara picked at a splinter on the crate. "Didn't feel right. That's not a reason. It's the only one I got." Illy studied her, and Clara felt the weight of his gaze. Not judging, just seeing, really seeing. Like he understood that sometimes the only reason you do something is because not doing it would break something inside you that can't be fixed. "You're a strange girl, Clara Wynne," he said finally. "You're a strange man, Illy Mercer." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Fair enough." The harmonica played on and the stars began to appear. First one, then a dozen, then too many to count. Clara leaned back against the stable wall and watched them multiply, feeling the day's work settle into her bones. She was tired, the kind of tired that felt earned. "You gonna stay?" she asked quietly. "After you're healed." Illy was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the music. "I don't know. Sheriff wants you gone. I know. And if you stay, they'll come for you. I know that too." Clara looked at him, at the way the fireflies had started to blink in the grass around them, little pulses of light in the darkness. "Then why don't you just leave?" Illy stared out at the town, at the buildings that had watched him grow up, watched him run, watched him disappear. His jaw tightened, and when he answered, his voice was rough with something Clara couldn't name. "Because I'm tired of running." The words hung between them, heavy and true. Clara nodded slowly. She understood that too. She'd been running her whole life, from hunger, from cold, from people who looked through her like she wasn't there. And maybe Illy was right. Maybe there came a point where you had to stop, where you had to turn around and face the thing that was chasing you, even if it meant you might not survive. The harmonica faded, the last notes drifting away into the night. And in the silence that followed, Clara heard it. The distant sound of hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Illy heard it too. He straightened, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver he'd tucked into his belt earlier. Clara's heart kicked hard against her ribs. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, and then a shape appeared at the far end of the street. A rider, silhouetted against the last light of the day, moving toward them with purpose. Illy stood. Clara stood beside him. The rider came closer, and as he passed beneath the lantern outside the saloon, Clara saw his face. It was the sheriff, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode 3 more men, their hats pulled low, their faces hard in the lamplight. They moved in a line, slow and steady, like a storm rolling in. And when they reached the stable, they stopped. The sheriff looked down at Illy, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. Illy didn't move. "So talk." Garrett dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The other men stayed on their horses, watching, their hands resting near their guns. "There's been complaints," Garrett said. "People saying you've been stirring trouble. I fixed a fence, and people don't like it." Illy's jaw tightened. "People don't like a lot of things. That's the problem." Garrett stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "You being here makes people nervous, makes them remember things they'd rather forget. That's not my problem. It is when they start asking questions, when they start wondering if maybe they got it wrong all those years ago." Garrett's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Illy. "When they start thinking maybe you deserve another chance." Illy stared at him, understanding dawning slow and cold. "You don't want me here," Illy said quietly, "because if I stay, people might start remembering what really happened." Garrett didn't deny it. Didn't confirm it either, just stood there, stone-faced, his hand resting on his belt. "You got 2 days," he said finally, "then you ride out, or I'll make you." He turned and climbed back onto his horse. The other men wheeled their mounts around, and together they rode back the way they'd come, disappearing into the darkness. Clara let out a shaky breath. Illy stood still, staring after them, his hand still on his gun. "You all right?" Clara asked. He didn't answer right away. Just stood there, the fireflies blinking around him, the night pressing close. "No," he said finally, "but I will be." They didn't sleep much that night. Clara lay on her usual spot on the hay, staring at the rafters, listening to the sound of Illy's breathing on the other side of the stable. He didn't sleep either. She could tell by the way he shifted, restless, the way his boots scraped against the floor every so often. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly fixed fence. The horses stirred in the paddock, uneasy, and somewhere in the distance a dog howled, long and mournful, a sound that felt like a warning. Clara pulled the saddle blanket tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come, because she knew, deep in the marrow of her bones, that the quiet was ending. And when morning came, everything would be different. Dawn broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that hadn't been there the night before. Clara woke to the sound of rain, soft at first, just a whisper against the roof, then harder, drumming steady on the stable's tin. She sat up and looked around. Illy was gone. Panic flared in her chest. She scrambled to her feet and ran to the door, throwing it open. He stood in the paddock, rain soaking through his shirt, his hand on the gray mare's neck. The horses stood around him, heads down, patient and still, and for a moment Clara just watched. This man and these forgotten animals, finding something like peace in the rain. Then Illy turned and saw her. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at her across the distance, rain running down his face, and nodded once. Clara nodded back, and in that small, silent exchange she understood. He wasn't leaving yet. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but the clock was ticking. And when the time came, she didn't know if she'd be able to let him go. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the streets, turning the world soft and gray. And inside the stable, as Clara stood in the doorway watching Illy tend to the horses, she felt the quiet settle over them one last time. Fragile, precious, already slipping away. The rain stopped by mid-morning, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Puddles dotted the street, reflecting pieces of sky. The air smelled like wet earth and iron, and somewhere a crow called out, harsh and insistent, like it was trying to warn someone of something they couldn't see yet. Clara stood in the stable doorway, watching the town come alive. More people than usual moved through the streets. She could feel it, the way the air had changed, grown heavier. The way folks gathered in small clusters, heads bent together, voices low. Something was happening. Illy felt it too. He'd been quiet all morning, moving through his work with the horses like he was counting down to something inevitable. Now he stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the street with those storm, gray eyes. "They're gathering," Clara said quietly. "I know." "What are you gonna do?" He didn't answer. Just stood there, jaw tight, watching. By noon, the whispers had turned to shouts. Clara heard them rising from the center of town, voices overlapping, angry and afraid, the kind of noise that meant a crowd was forming, meant decisions were being made, meant someone was going to pay for something. Illy stepped out of the stable. "Don't," Clara said, reaching for his arm. He paused, looking down at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face. "I have to." "You don't. You could just run." He said it gently but firm. "I told you, Clara, I'm done running." She wanted to argue, wanted to pull him back inside, bar the door, hide him away where they couldn't find him. But she saw it in his eyes, the resolve, hard as iron. He'd made his choice, so she let go and followed him into the street. The crowd had gathered in the town square, beneath the old iron bell that hadn't rung in years. 50 people, maybe more, men in work clothes and women with shawls pulled tight, children peeking between their parents' legs. At the center stood Sheriff Garrett, flanked by his deputies, their faces hard and official. The crowd parted as Illy walked through, not out of respect, out of fear. Clara stayed close behind him, small and invisible in his shadow. No one looked at her. All eyes were on Illy, on the man who'd come back from the dead, the ghost they'd tried to bury. Illy stopped 10 feet from the sheriff. The crowd went quiet. Garrett stepped forward, thumbs hooked in his belt, his badge catching the pale sunlight. He looked at Illy for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to face the crowd. "Most of you know why we're here," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the square. "Illy Mercer has returned to Copper Bend. Some of you remember him. Some of you remember what happened to his family." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. 15 years ago. Garrett continued. "The Mercer ranch burned to the ground. Samuel Mercerly's father died in that fire, and Illy here was accused of starting it. Accused of killing his own blood for the land, for the money, for the title to this town." Illy stood perfectly still, his face empty of expression. "He ran before we could bring him to trial," Garrett said. "Disappeared into the territory and left us to clean up the mess. Left us to bury his father. Left us to wonder if we'd sheltered a murderer all those years." "That's a lie." The voice came from the crowd, a woman's voice, sharp and clear. Clara turned and saw her step forward, middle-aged grace, streaked hair pulled back, her face lined with years but her eyes bright and fierce. Garrett's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hayes, you know it's a lie, Garrett." The woman looked at Illy, and something in her expression softened. "We all know." "What we know," Garrett said coldly, "is that a man died and his son ran. Because you chased him out, Mrs." Hayes turned to the crowd. "Half of you were there. You saw what they did. How they came for him in the night. How they beat him bloody and told him if he didn't leave, they'd hang him without a trial." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "That was 15 years ago," someone muttered. 15 years or 50, it doesn't change what happened," Mrs. Hayes said. She looked at Illy again. "Your father was a good man, and you didn't kill him." Illy's throat worked. He nodded once, unable to speak. Garrett stepped between them, his voice rising. "Doesn't matter what any of us think. What matters is the law, and the law says Illy Mercer is wanted for arson and murder. There was no trial, Mrs. Hayes shot back. "Because he ran. Because you gave him no choice." The crowd erupted, voices clashing, people shouting over each other, the square dissolving into chaos. Clara pressed closer to Illy, her heart hammering. She could feel the anger radiating off the crowd, thick and dangerous. Then Illy spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "It's true." The crowd went silent. Illy looked at Garrett, then at the people gathered around him. "I ran. I left without fighting, without defending myself, and I've spent 15 years wondering if that made me guilty." No one moved. "But I didn't kill my father," Illy continued, his voice steady. "And I didn't burn the ranch. What I did," he paused, his jaw tightening, "what I did was survive, because that's all a 16-year-old boy knew how to do when the whole town turned on him." Garrett's hand moved toward his gun. "Illy, I know who did it." The words dropped like stones into still water. Garrett froze. The crowd leaned in, hungry. Illy reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, yellowed at the edges, the creases worn from being opened and closed too many times. "My father wrote a will," Illy said, 3 days before he died. He had it notarized in Clayton, 2 towns over, because he didn't trust anyone here. He unfolded the paper and held it up. "This will leaves everything. The ranch, the land, the water rights, the title to Copper Bend. To me. But it also names 3 men as witnesses. 3 men who swore they'd protect the claim if anything happened to him." Illy's eyes moved across the crowd, landing on 3 faces. "Thomas Reeves, Martin Cole, and you, Garrett." The sheriff's face went white. "You were there," Illy said quietly. "You knew what my father wanted. You knew he was afraid someone would come after him for the land. And when the ranch burned, when he died," Illy's voice hardened, "you took his will and buried it. You buried the truth, and you let me take the blame." Garrett's hand was on his gun now, knuckles white. "You're lying," he said. "Am I?" Illy took a step forward. "Then explain why the land that was supposed to be mine is now divided between you 3. Explain why you're wearing a badge and living in a house that used to belong to my family. Explain why my father's name is erased from every deed, every document in this town." The crowd was a living thing now. Angry, confused, turning on itself. People looked at Garrett, at the other 2 men Illy had named, their faces twisted with suspicion and dawning realization. "He's got no proof," Garrett said, but his voice wavered. Illy held up the will. "This is proof. That's a forgery. Then let's ride to Clayton and check the records. Let's bring the notary here to testify." Illy's voice was cold now, sharp as winter. "Or are you afraid of what he'll say?" Garrett stared at him, and in that moment Clara saw it. The crack in the sheriff's armor, the flicker of fear behind his eyes. He was guilty. They all were. The crowd saw it too. "He's telling the truth," someone said. "Always wondered how Garrett got that land. Said he bought it fair. But from who? Got him thieves, the lot of them." Garrett's hand tightened on his gun. "Shut up. All of you, shut up." But the crowd didn't shut up. They pressed closer, voices rising, anger building like a storm. Garrett looked at Illy, and his expression twisted. Fear and rage and something darker. "You think you can just walk back in here and take it all back? You think they'll believe you? I don't care if they believe me." Illy said quietly, "I just want them to know the truth." Garrett's face went hard. "You want the truth. The truth is your father was a coward. The truth is he was weak, and this town needed strong men to survive. We did what had to be done." The admission hung in the air like smoke. The crowd erupted. People surged forward, shouting, their voices a wave of fury. Garrett stumbled back, his deputies closing ranks around him, hands on their guns, but the crowd didn't stop. They pressed in, demanding answers, demanding justice. And in the chaos, Illy turned and walked away. Clara chased after him, her breath coming fast. Illy, he didn't stop. Just kept walking, his shoulders tight, his hands clenched into fists. "You did it," Clara said, catching up to him. "They know now, they know you didn't, doesn't matter." "What do you mean it doesn't matter? You proved." Illy spun on her, and the look in his eyes stopped her cold. "It doesn't bring him back, Clara. Doesn't change what they did. Doesn't erase 15 years. His voice cracked on the last word, and Clara saw it then. The grief he'd been carrying, the weight of it pressing down on him like stone. "I know," she said softly. "But at least now they know the truth." Illy stared at her, and for a moment she thought he might break, might let the armor fall away and show her the wound underneath. But he didn't. Just nodded once and turned back toward the stable. Behind them, the crowd was still shouting, still demanding. And as they walked away, Clara heard the sound of breaking glass, of doors slamming, of a town tearing itself apart trying to find someone to blame. They spent the rest of the day in the stable, listening to the chaos unfold. Gunshots echoed through the streets, warning shots, Clara hoped, not aimed at anyone. Voices rose and fell, angry and afraid. By evening, the noise had died down to murmurs, and by nightfall, the town was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now, heavy, waiting. Clara sat against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, watching Illy as he worked on his saddle, polishing the leather, checking the straps, preparing. She knew what it meant, knew what he was getting ready for. "You're leaving," she said. He didn't look up, soon. "Because of what happened. Because if I stay, Someone's going to get hurt. He glanced at her. Probably you. Clara's chest tightened. I can take care of myself. I know you can. He set the saddle aside and looked at her properly. But you shouldn't have to, not because of me. What if I want to? Illy's expression softened. Clara, I mean it. She stood, crossing to him. You fixed things. You told the truth. You made them see. I made them angry. Illy said quietly. And angry people do stupid things. Clara wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him he was wrong, that the town would settle, that everything would be fine. But she knew better. She'd seen the look in Garrett's eyes. The fear and the hate twisting together into something dangerous. Then take me with you, she said. Illy stared at her. What, when you leave, take me with you? Clara, you can't. Why not? I got nothing here. No family, no home, nothing. She stepped closer, her voice urgent. But with you I could, I don't know, I could help, I could work. You could have a life. Illy said gently, a real one, not running, not hiding. You deserve that. I deserve to choose. They stared at each other in the dim light, the weight of the words hanging between them. Finally, Illy sighed. I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Clara nodded and returned to her spot against the wall. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of smoke. Clara's head snapped up. You smell that? Illy was already moving, crossing to the door and throwing it open. The sky to the east glowed orange. Fire, stay here, Illy said, his voice hard, but Clara was already running. The fire had started in the old barn at the edge of town, the one where Illy's horse had been stabled, where Clara had pulled him from the storm. Flames climbed the walls, bright and hungry, devouring the dry wood like paper. Smoke billowed into the sky, thick and black, blotting out the stars. Clara ran toward it, her lungs burning, her heart hammering. She could hear the horses screaming, high, panicked, the sound of animals trapped and terrified. Illy was already there, kicking open the barn door, disappearing into the smoke. Illy? Clara screamed, but he was gone. She hesitated for half a second, then plunged in after him. The heat hit her like a wall. Smoke filled her lungs, choking her, blinding her. She dropped low, crawling forward, her eyes streaming. Through the haze, she saw shapes, horses rearing, kicking at their stalls, eyes rolling white with terror. Illy was at the nearest stall, wrestling with the latch, coughing violently. Clara scrambled to the next one, her fingers fumbling with the bolt. It was hot, too hot, but she ignored the pain and yanked it open. The horse bolted past her, nearly knocking her down. She moved to the next stall, and the next. Behind her, a beam cracked and fell, sending up a shower of sparks. The flames roared louder, closing in. Clara, Illy's voice, hoarse and desperate. She turned and saw him dragging something from the back of the barn. Saddles, blankets, anything he could save. His face was black with soot, his eyes red and streaming. Get out, he shouted. Not without you. Another beam fell, this one closer. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Clara stumbled toward Illy, reaching for him, and together they staggered toward the door. The last horse, the gray mare, stood frozen in her stall, too terrified to move. Illy let go of Clara and turned back. No, Clara grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. He disappeared into the smoke. Clara stood at the edge of the barn, coughing, tears streaming down her face, watching the flames consume everything. She couldn't see him, couldn't hear him over the roar of the fire. Then, through the smoke, a shape emerged. Illy, leading the gray mare by her mane, his other arm wrapped around the horse's neck, guiding her toward the door. The mare's eyes were white with fear, but she followed him, trusting him even through the terror. They burst out of the barn together, collapsing onto the ground as the roof caved in behind them. The barn collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, the walls folding inward, everything consumed. Clara crawled to Illy's side. He lay on his back, chest heaving, his face black with soot and streaked with sweat. The mare stood beside him, trembling but alive. You're an idiot, Clara said, her voice shaking. Illy coughed, a sound that turned into something like laughter. Yeah, people were gathering now, drawn by the fire. They stood in a circle, watching the barn burn, their faces lit orange by the flames. No one moved to help, no one spoke. Clara looked at them, and she felt something cold settle in her chest. They'd done this, or they'd let it happen. Either way, it was the same. Garrett stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable in the firelight. He met Illy's eyes across the distance, and in that moment, Clara saw the truth. This wasn't an accident. This was a warning. Illy saw it too. He pushed himself up, wincing. His hand pressed against his ribs where the wound had torn open again. Blood seeped through his shirt, dark and wet. But he didn't look away from Garrett. Just stared at him, silent and steady, his jaw set. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the square, clear and cold. You want me gone that bad, Garrett, then say it. Don't burn down what's already broken and pretend it's justice. The sheriff didn't answer, just turned and walked away. The crowd followed, drifting back into the shadows, leaving Clara and Illy alone with the burning barn and the smoke and the ashes. Clara helped Illy to his feet. He swayed, unsteady, but he didn't fall. Together, they walked back to the stable, the gray mare following close behind. And as the fire burned itself out behind them, Clara looked up at the sky and saw the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Soft at first, then harder, washing the smoke away, but not the memory, not the anger, not the fear. When they reached the stable, Illy collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. Clara knelt beside him, checking his wound. The bandage was soaked through, the stitches torn. You need a doctor, she said. I need to leave. Not like this. You'll bleed out before you make it a mile. Illy closed his eyes. Then I guess I'm not going anywhere. Clara sat back, staring at him. At this man who'd saved horses from a burning barn, who'd stood in front of a crowd and demanded truth, who'd refused to run even when running was the only smart thing to do. And she made a decision. Then I'm staying too, she said quietly. Illy opened his eyes. Clara, I'm staying, and if they come for you, they'll have to go through me first. A smile ghosted across Illy's face, tired, sad, but real. You're stubborn as hell, you know that, you're one to talk. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming on the roof, washing the night clean. And in the stable, as Clara pressed a clean cloth to Illy's wound, and he closed his eyes and let her, they found something neither of them had expected. Not safety, not peace, but something close to home, fragile, fleeting, but real, and worth fighting for. The rain stopped before dawn, leaving the world cold and wet and smelling of ash. Clara woke to find Illy already awake, sitting against the stable wall, staring at nothing. His face was drawn, pale beneath the soot she hadn't managed to wash away. The bandage she'd wrapped around his ribs during the night was already seeping red. She sat up, her body aching from sleeping on the floor, and looked at him. You didn't sleep, she said. Couldn't. Because of the pain, because of everything. Clara understood. She'd lain awake most of the night too, listening to his breathing, making sure it stayed steady, making sure he stayed alive. Outside, the town was beginning to stir. She heard the creak of doors opening, the shuffle of boots on wet wood. People moving careful and quiet, like they were afraid of waking something they'd tried to put to sleep. Illy shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. I need to see it. See what's left. Clara knew he meant the barn, the place where everything had burned. She wanted to tell him not to go, to stay here where it was safe, or as safe as anywhere in Copper Bend could be. But she saw the look in his eyes and knew there was no stopping him. Then I'm coming with you, she said. He didn't argue. They walked through the empty streets as the sun rose, pale and cold behind a veil of clouds. The air still smelled like smoke, thick and bitter, clinging to everything. Clara's bare feet splashed through puddles, mud seeping between her toes, but she barely noticed. The barn, what was left of it, stood at the edge of town like a skeleton. The walls had collapsed inward, leaving only the blackened frame standing against the gray sky. Smoke still rose from the rubble in thin, ghostly tendrils. The ground around it was scorched. The grass burned away to reveal bare earth. Illy stopped at the edge of the destruction and just stood there, staring. Clara stood beside him, not speaking, letting him take it in. After a long moment, he walked forward, stepping carefully over the charred remains of what had once been a door. Clara followed, her heart tight in her chest. The heat still radiated from the ground, seeping through the soles of her feet. Ash crunched beneath them, soft and gray, drifting up with each step like snow. Illy knelt in the center of what had been the barn, running his hand through the ash. His fingers found something, a piece of metal, twisted and blackened. He lifted it, turning it over in his palm, a horseshoe. He stared at it for a long moment, then closed his fist around it. "My father built this barn," he said quietly. "When I was 6, I remember holding the nails for him, handing them up one at a time. He'd talk while he worked, tell me stories about the drives, about the land, about what it meant to build something that would last." His voice caught, and Clara saw his jaw tighten. He said, "If you build something right, it'll outlive you. It'll stand long after you're gone, and people will know you were here, that you mattered." Illy looked up at the ruins around them, and now it's ash. Clara knelt beside him, her hand hovering near his shoulder, wanting to touch him but not sure if she should. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "Isn't it?" He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was raw. "I came back. I stirred everything up. If I'd just stayed gone, then they'd have won." Clara's voice was firm. "They'd have kept what they stole, kept lying about what happened, and your father's name would still be dirt. At least the barn would still be standing." "The barn was already dying," Clara said, "just like everything else in this town. You didn't burn it, they did, because they're afraid of the truth." Illy stared at her, something shifting in his expression. Then he looked back down at the horseshoe in his hand and nodded slowly. They stayed there for a while, sitting in the ash, watching the sun climb higher. Around them, the town continued to wake. Doors opening, voices rising, the sound of a wagon rattling down the street. But no one came near them, no one called out or offered help. They were alone. Finally, Illy stood, slipping the horseshoe into his pocket. "Come on, we should go back." Clara stood, brushing ash from her dress, and followed him. But as they turned to leave, she saw something that made her stop. Footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the mud at the edge of the burned ground. They led away from the barn, heading toward the center of town. And beside them, clear as day, were the marks of something being dragged. "Illy," she said quietly. He turned and saw what she was looking at. His expression hardened. "Someone was here." Clara said, "After the fire, they took something." Illy crouched, studying the tracks. "Or they left something." He stood and followed the trail, moving faster now, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip. Clara hurried after him, her heart pounding. The tracks led them through the muddy street, past the saloon, past the shuttered general store. And then they stopped at the door of the stable, their stable. Illy's hand went to his gun, drawing it slow and smooth. He motioned for Clara to stay back, then pushed the door open. Inside, everything was exactly as they'd left it. The saddle in the corner, the blankets on the floor, the gray mare standing in her stall, calm and undisturbed. But something was different. On the wall, painted in ash and water, were words. "Leave or burn." Clara's breath caught. Illy stared at the message, his jaw working, his knuckles white around the grip of his gun. "They're not gonna stop." Clara whispered, "I know. They're gonna keep coming until I know." Illy holstered his gun and turned to her, his face hard but his eyes soft. "Which is why I'm leaving. Tonight." "What? No. Clara, look at this." He gestured to the words on the wall. "They burned the barn. They'll burn this place next. And if you're here when they do, then I burn with it. I already told you, you're not listening." Illy grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "This isn't your fight. You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything." The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. "You fixed things, you saw me, you made me feel like I wasn't nothing." Illy's expression crumpled. "Clara, If you leave, I'm alone again, and I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't go back to that." Illy pulled her into his arms, and Clara buried her face in his chest, her shoulders shaking. He held her tight, his chin resting on top of her head, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "You're not nothing," he said quietly. "You're the bravest person I've ever met. Then let me come with you." He pulled back, looking down at her, and she saw the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to protect her fighting with the part that didn't want to be alone. "If you come," he said slowly, "it won't be easy. I don't have money, don't have a home, don't have anything but a horse and a name nobody trusts. I don't care. You should. But I don't." Clara looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "I've been alone my whole life, Illy, and I'm tired of it. So if you're leaving, then I'm coming. And if you try to stop me, I'll just follow you anyway." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth despite everything. "You really are stubborn as hell." "So are you," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, then nodded. "All right, but we leave before dark, before they have a chance to come back." Clara nodded, relief flooding through her. "And Clara," Illy's voice was serious now, "if things go bad, if I tell you to run, you run. You don't look back, you don't wait for me. You just go, understood?" She wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him she'd never leave him. But she saw the look in his eyes and knew this was the only way he'd let her come. "Understood," she lied. They spent the day preparing. Illy checked the gray mare's hooves, tightened her saddle, packed what little they had into saddlebags. Clara gathered food. Stale bread, dried meat, a canteen of water. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of Copper Bend. As the sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold, Clara took one last look around the stable. This place had been her shelter, her home, the first real home she'd had in years, and now she was leaving it behind. "You ready?" Illy asked, leading the mare out into the fading light. Clara nodded, though her throat felt tight. They walked the horse toward the edge of town, moving quiet and careful, staying in the shadows. The streets were emptying as people headed inside for the night. Lanterns flickering to life in windows. No one looked their way, no one seemed to notice. They were almost clear when Clara heard it. A shout. She turned and saw them. 5 men, maybe 6, emerging from behind the saloon. Garrett led them, his face hard in the dying light, his hand on his gun. "Going somewhere, Mercer," the sheriff called out. Illy stopped. His hand moved to his revolver, but he didn't draw. "Just leaving, like you wanted." "Little late for that." Garrett stepped closer, and the men with him fanned out, surrounding them. "You stood in front of the whole town and called us thieves, called us murderers. You think we're just gonna let you walk away? I told the truth. Your truth." Garrett spat in the dust. "But truth don't matter much when you're dead." Illy's jaw tightened. "You really want to do this, Garrett? In front of witnesses?" "What witnesses?" Garrett gestured around the empty street. "Town's asleep. And even if they weren't, you think anybody's gonna speak up for you." He had a point. Clara looked around desperately, but the windows were dark, the doors closed. If anyone was watching, they weren't showing themselves. Illy's hand hovered over his gun. "Let the girl go. She's got nothing to do with this. She's with you. That makes her part of it." Garrett's eyes flicked to Clara, cold and empty. "Should have stayed in your place, girl. Should have kept your head down." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I ain't going nowhere. Suit yourself." Garrett's hand moved toward his gun. And then, from somewhere behind them, a voice rang out. "You fire that gun, Garrett, and you'll answer to me." Everyone turned. Mrs. Hayes stood at the edge of the square, a shotgun cradled in her arms. Behind her, others were emerging from the shadows. A dozen townspeople, maybe more, their faces hard and determined. "This ends now," Mrs. Hayes said, her voice steady. "No more burning, no more threats. These people are leaving, and you're going to let them." Garrett stared at her, his face twisting with rage. "You're making a mistake." "The mistake was made 15 years ago," Mrs. Hayes said, "when we let you drive an innocent boy out of town, when we believed your lies, when we stood by and did nothing." She raised the shotgun slightly, not quite aiming it, but making her point clear. Not again. For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension hung thick in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Clara held her breath, waiting. Then, slowly, Garrett lowered his hand from his gun. "This ain't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes," Mrs. Hayes said quietly, "it is." Garrett stared at her, then at Ellie, his eyes burning with hate. But he stepped back, and after a moment his men did too. "Get out of my town," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "It was never your town," Ellie said quietly, and then he turned, took the mare's reins, and walked away. Clara followed, not daring to look back. Behind them, she heard Mrs. Hayes and the others holding their ground, keeping Garrett and his men at bay. They reached the edge of town as the last light faded from the sky. Ellie mounted the gray mare and reached down to pull Clara up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Hold on," he said. And then they rode. They rode through the night, putting distance between themselves and Copper Bend. The mare was strong, her gait smooth and steady, carrying them across the flats as the stars wheeled overhead. Clara clung to Ellie, her cheek pressed against his back, feeling the thunder of the horses' hooves beneath them. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Everything they'd known, everything they'd fought for, was behind them now, burning away into memory. As dawn began to break, pale and cold on the horizon, Ellie slowed the mare to a walk. They'd reached a small rise overlooking a valley, green and dotted with wildflowers. A creek ran through it, glinting silver in the early light. Ellie dismounted and helped Clara down. She stumbled, her legs stiff from riding, and he steadied her. They stood together on the rise, looking back the way they'd come. In the distance, barely visible through the morning haze, Copper Bend sat silent and small, a collection of dark shapes against the pale sky. Clara stared at it, feeling something twist in her chest. It had never been a home, not really, but it had been all she'd known. "You all right?" Ellie asked quietly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood there as the sun rose, washing the world in gold and pink. The mare grazed nearby, tearing up mouthfuls of sweet grass. Birds began to sing, and slowly the night's fear began to fade. "What now?" Clara asked finally. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled the horseshoe from his pocket, the one he'd found in the ashes, and looked at it. "Now, he said slowly, "we build something new, something that'll last." Clara looked up at him. "Like what?" A small smile crossed his face. "I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out." He slipped the horseshoe back into his pocket and turned toward the valley below. "Come on, let's find some water, get some rest." They led the mare down the slope, toward the creek, toward the green valley that stretched out before them like a promise. And as they walked, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the desperate kind that clings to anything just to survive, but the real kind, the kind that believes in tomorrow. Behind them, Copper Bend faded into the distance, growing smaller and smaller until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon. And ahead of them, the world opened up, vast and uncertain and full of possibility. They'd lost everything, but they'd found each other, and for now, that was enough. By midday, they'd made camp beside the creek. Ellie tended to the mare, while Clara gathered kindling for a fire. The wound in his side had started bleeding again during the ride, but he didn't complain, just gritted his teeth and kept moving. When the fire was crackling, Clara made him sit while she checked the bandage. The wound looked angry, red around the edges, but not infected. She cleaned it as best she could with creek water and rewrapped it with a strip torn from her dress. "You're getting good at this," Ellie said, watching her work. "Had a lot of practice lately." He smiled faintly. "Sorry about that." "Don't be." Clara tied off the bandage and sat back. "If you hadn't gotten hurt, we never would have met." "True." He looked at her, something soft in his expression. "Strange how things work out." "Yeah." They ate in silence, the last of the bread, shared between them, washed down with cold creek water. It wasn't much, but after everything, it tasted like a feast. When they finished, Illy lay back on the grass, staring up at the sky. Clara lay beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "After all this, all the time, and I don't know." He turned his head to look at her. "But I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of being afraid." "So what do you want?" Illy thought about that. "I want a place, somewhere quiet. Somewhere I can wake up and not wonder if today's the day someone comes for me." "Sounds nice. What about you?" Clara considered. "I want to not be hungry, and I want," she hesitated, "I want to matter to someone." Illy's hand found hers in the grass, his fingers curling around hers. "You matter to me," he said quietly. Clara's throat tightened. She squeezed his hand, unable to speak. They lay there as the sun climbed higher, warming the earth, drying the grass. The mare grazed nearby, and the creek burbled softly, and for the first time in as long as Clara could remember, the world felt peaceful. Safe, like maybe, just maybe, they'd found a place where they could rest. Even if it was only for a little while. As evening fell, Clara woke from a doze to find Illy sitting up, staring back the way they'd come. She followed his gaze and saw it, a thin column of smoke rising into the sky, dark against the fading light. "Is that," she started, "Copper Bend?" Illy finished. They watched the smoke rise, thick and black, and Clara knew without asking what it meant. Another fire, another warning, or maybe something worse. Illy's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't stand, didn't reach for his gun. "Aren't you going back?" Clara asked. "No. But they might need." "They made their choice," Illy said quietly. "Just like I made mine." He turned away from the smoke, back toward the valley, toward the creek and the green grass and the future stretching out before them. "Come on," he said. "Let's get some more wood for the fire. It's gonna be a cold night." Clara hesitated, looking back one last time at the smoke rising from Copper Bend. Then she turned and followed Illy into the gathering dusk. Behind them, the past burned. Ahead, the future waited, uncertain, fragile, but theirs. And as the stars began to appear, one by one, Clara made a promise to herself. Whatever came next, whatever they had to face, they'd face it together. And that would be enough. Clara opened her eyes to find the world painted silver, every blade of grass shimmering in the early light. Her breath plumed white in the cold air, and she pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, shivering. Beside her, Illy was already awake. He sat cross-legged by the dead fire, staring at something in his hands. As Clara sat up, she saw what it was: the scorched paper, his father's will, unfolded and creased from being read too many times. "You're up early," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "Couldn't stop thinking." "About what?" He looked at her, and in the gray morning light, his face was drawn, older than his years. "About what I left behind." Clara wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and moved closer, sitting beside him. The creek burbled nearby, but everything else was silent. No birds, no wind, just the vast emptiness of the valley around them. "You mean Copper Bend?" she asked. "I mean everything." Illy folded the will carefully, sliding it back into his coat. "My father spent his whole life building something, and in one night it was gone, turned to ash. That wasn't your fault." "Maybe not, but I ran from it. And for 15 years, I let them think I was guilty. Let them live on stolen land. Let them prosper, while my father's name rotted in the ground with him." His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "That was my fault." Clara studied him. "What are you saying?" Illy stood, brushing frost from his pants. He walked to the edge of the creek and stared across the water, his shoulders tense. "I'm saying I shouldn't have left. They would have killed you. Maybe." He turned to face her. "But at least I would have stood my ground. At least I would have fought for what was right." Clara's chest tightened. "You want to go back?" It wasn't a question. Illy didn't answer right away. Just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the war. The part of him that wanted to keep running, to keep her safe, fighting with the part that couldn't live with himself if he didn't finish what he'd started. "That smoke yesterday," he said slowly, Could have been another barn, could have been someone's house, could have been Mrs. Hayes burning for standing up to Garrett. You don't know that, no, but I can't stop thinking about it. He walked back to her, kneeling so they were eye to eye. Clara, I can't run anymore. I tried. God knows I tried. But every time I close my eyes, I see my father's face. I hear him telling me to build something that lasts. And I can't do that if I'm always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up. So you want to go back and what? Fight them? No. Illy's voice was firm. I want to go back and tell the truth, the whole truth. Put it in front of everyone, undeniable, so they can't hide from it anymore. You already did that. It didn't work. Because I was alone. Because I didn't have proof beyond the will. Illy pulled something else from his coat. A small leather journal, water, stained and worn. But I found this 3 days ago in the ashes of the barn. It's my father's ledger. Every transaction, every deal, every piece of land he owned. All documented, all witnessed. Clara stared at the journal. Where was it? Hidden in a metal box under the floorboards. Must have survived the fire. Illy opened it, showing her pages filled with careful handwriting. This shows everything, Clara, who owned what, who owed what, who witnessed what. And it proves that Garrett and his men didn't just steal the land. They forged documents to do it. That's not just theft. That's fraud. Clara's heart began to pound. If you show them this, they'll have to face what they did. They'll have to answer for it, or they'll kill you. Maybe. Illy closed the journal, but I have to try. Clara wanted to argue. Wanted to grab him and shake him and tell him he was being stupid. That nothing was worth dying for. That they could just keep riding and never look back. But she saw the look in his eyes. The determination, the resolve, the quiet certainty of a man who'd finally found something worth standing for. And she knew she couldn't stop him. Then I'm coming with you, she said. Clara, don't. She stood, the blanket falling from her shoulders. You think I dragged you out of a storm, patched you up, ran from a burning barn, and rode through the night just to watch you ride back alone. You think I came this far just to let you go? Illy stared at her, and something in his expression softened. You're the stubbornest person I've ever met. Good thing you need stubborn right now. A smile ghosted across his face despite everything. Then he nodded, all right. But we do this smart. We don't ride in angry. We don't give them an excuse to shoot first and ask questions later. So what do? Illy looked toward the horizon, toward the thin trail of smoke that still rose in the distance. We ride in at dawn, when the whole town's awake, when everyone can see, and we lay it all out. The will, the ledger, everything, in front of witnesses. In front of God and everybody. And if Garrett tries to stop you, then I guess we find out if there's any justice left in Copper Bend. They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, melting the frost into dew. Illy saddled the gray mare while Clara packed what little they had. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much to say. They both knew what was coming. Before mounting, Illy checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder, checking load, sliding it back into its holster. His movements were practiced, automatic, the muscle memory of a man who'd learned to be ready for trouble. Clara watched him, her stomach tight with worry. You know how to use that thing? Yeah, she hesitated. You ever shot anyone? Illy paused, his hand resting on the gun. Once, long time ago, man tried to rob me on the trail north, came at me with a knife. Did you kill him? No, just winged him. Enough to make him think twice. He looked at her. I'm not a killer, Clara. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I won't let them hurt you either. Clara nodded, believing him. They rode through the morning, the mare carrying them steady across the flats. The land was brown and dry, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. Above them, hawks circled lazy against the pale sky. As they rode, Clara found herself studying Illy's back, the set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins loose and confident. He looked different than he had a week ago, stronger, more sure, like he'd finally stopped running from himself. You scared? She asked after a while. Yeah, me too. Good. Means you're smart. They rode in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara tried not to think about what might happen when they reached Copper Bend. Tried not to picture Garrett's face, or the guns, or the moment when everything could go wrong. Instead, She thought about the valley they'd left behind, about the green grass and the cold creek, and the way the frost had sparkled in the morning light. She thought about lying beside Illy in the grass, watching the clouds drift by, feeling safe for the first time in her life. And she promised herself that no matter what happened today, they'd find their way back to that feeling, even if she had to drag them both there. They reached Copper Bend as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The town looked smaller than Clara remembered, just a collection of tired buildings huddled together against the emptiness. But it was still standing, no new fires, no new ruins. That was something, at least. They rode slowly down the main street, Illy sitting tall in the saddle, Clara behind him with her arms around his waist. People stopped to stare, standing in doorways, pausing mid-step, their faces showing surprise, fear, and something that might have been curiosity. Illy didn't look at them, just kept the mare walking steady toward the center of town, toward the iron bell that stood in the square. When they reached it, he dismounted and helped Clara down. Then he turned to face the street. "I need to speak to everyone," he called out, his voice carrying across the square. "Anyone who will listen. I have something to show you." No one moved at first, just stood there, watching, waiting. Then Mrs. Hayes emerged from the general store, her face lined with worry. "Illy, boy, what are you doing here? I thought you left." "I did, but I came back." "Why?" "Because I'm done running." Illy reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger. "And because I have proof, real proof, of everything that happened." Mrs. Hayes's eyes widened. She stepped closer, and others began to follow, curious, cautious, drawn by the promise of truth or scandal or both. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, not as big as before, but enough to matter. Illy climbed onto the steps beneath the iron bell so everyone could see him. Clara stood beside him, her heart hammering. 15 years ago, Illy began, his voice steady and clear. "My father died in a fire, and I was accused of killing him, of burning down our home for money and land. I ran because I was 16 and scared, and I didn't know what else to do." The crowd murmured, but no one interrupted. "But I didn't kill my father," Illy continued, "and I didn't burn the ranch. What I did was survive. And while I survived, 3 men took everything my family built. The land, the water rights, the title to this town. They forged documents, they buried evidence, and they let me take the blame." He held up the ledger. "This is my father's record book. Every transaction, every witness, every piece of land he owned, documented. And it proves that Sheriff Garrett, Thomas Reeves, and Martin Cole committed fraud, that they stole what was rightfully mine and built their lives on lies." The crowd erupted, voices rising, people shouting questions, anger and confusion swirling together. "Show us," someone yelled. "Let us see it." Illy opened the ledger and began to read. Names, dates, transactions. He showed pages to those closest, passing it around so they could see for themselves. Clara watched faces change as they read. Shock, anger, shame. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the noise. "That's enough." Everyone turned. Sheriff Garrett stood at the edge of the square, his hand resting on his gun. Behind him stood his deputies, armed and ready. "You've had your say, Mercer," Garrett said coldly. "Now it's time for you to leave." "I'm not done." "Yes, you are." Garrett stepped forward, and the crowd parted before him like water. "You come into my town, spread lies and accusations, try to turn people against their own. Illy's voice was hard as iron. "You mean against the men who stole from them, who lied to them, who've been bleeding this town dry for 15 years. Garrett's face went red. "You got no right. I have every right." Illy descended the steps, moving toward Garrett. "This was my father's town. My family built it, and you took it. Took everything. And you did it because you thought I was too weak to come back. Too scared to fight." He stopped 3 feet from the sheriff, close enough to see the fear flickering behind the anger in Garrett's eyes. "You were wrong." For a moment, Clara thought Garrett would draw. Thought this would end the way these things always ended, with gunfire and blood and someone lying in the dust. But Garrett didn't draw.
He just stood there, staring at Ellie, his hand trembling near his gun. And in that moment, the whole town saw it. Saw the fear, saw the guilt, saw the truth written across his face like a confession. "It was you," Mrs. Hayes said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence. "You burned the ranch. You killed Samuel." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Why?" someone asked. "Samuel was a good man. Why would you?" "Because he wouldn't sell." Garrett said, his voice low and bitter. "Because he owned the water rights, and without them, this town was dying. We needed that water, needed the land, and he wouldn't listen to reason. So you killed him." Mrs. Hayes's voice shook with fury. "You murdered him and framed his son. We did what we had to do." The words hung in the air like smoke. The crowd went silent, a terrible, heavy silence that pressed down on everything. Then someone stepped forward. An old man Clara didn't recognize, his face weathered and hard. "I was there," he said quietly, "the night of the fire. I saw you and your men riding away, saw the smoke, but I didn't say nothing because I was scared, because you said we'd all prosper if we kept quiet." Another voice spoke up. "You told us Ellie burned it. Told us he was dangerous. We believed you." A woman said, her voice breaking. "God help us, we believed you." Garrett looked around at the crowd, and for the first time, Clara saw panic in his eyes. He was losing them, losing the control he'd held for 15 years. "It doesn't matter what you believe," he said desperately. "The law, you are the law," Ellie said quietly, "and you're a murderer." Garrett's hand moved toward his gun, and everything happened at once. Ellie drew, fast, smooth, practiced. His revolver cleared the holster and leveled at Garrett's chest before the sheriff's fingers even touched his gun. The crowd gasped, stepping back. Garrett froze, his hand hovering near his weapon. "Don't," Ellie said softly. For a long moment, they stood there, Ellie with his gun drawn, Garrett with his hand frozen in mid-reach, the entire town holding its breath. Then, slowly, Garrett lowered his hand. "Smart choice," Ellie said. He kept the gun level, his hand steady. "Now, you're going to unbuckle that gun belt. You're going to hand it over, and you're going to tell everyone here what you did. All of it. No more lies." Garrett stared at him, hate burning in his eyes. "Do it," Mrs. Hayes said. "Tell us the truth." Garrett's jaw worked. His hands clenched into fists. And then, finally, he spoke. "We killed him." The words came out rough, forced. "Samuel Mercer, we set the fire, made it look like the boy did it. We took the land, divided it up, forged the papers." The crowd erupted again, shouts of anger, cries of outrage, but Ellie didn't lower his gun. "And now?" Ellie asked. Garrett looked at him, and something in his expression crumbled. The authority, the control, all of it falling away, leaving just a tired old man who'd lived too long with his sins. "Now I suppose you shoot me," Garrett said quietly. Ellie stared at him for a long moment. Then he lowered his gun and holstered it. "No," he said, "that's not justice, that's revenge." He turned to the crowd. "This town needs a real sheriff, someone who will uphold the law, not break it. Someone who will protect people, not prey on them." His eyes found Mrs. Hayes, someone the town can trust. Mrs. Hayes stepped forward, her shotgun still cradled in her arms. She looked at Garrett with contempt, then at Ellie with something like pride. "I'll do it," she said, "until we can hold a proper election." The crowd murmured agreement. Ellie nodded. "Then my first request as the rightful owner of this town," he looked at Garrett, "is that you be held for trial, with real witnesses." Two men stepped forward and took Garrett by the arms. He didn't resist, just stood there, defeated, as they led him away toward the jailhouse. The crowd began to disperse, people talking in low, urgent voices. Some approached Ellie, wanting to shake his hand, to apologize, to tell him they always believed him. He accepted their words with quiet grace, but Clara could see the exhaustion in his eyes. When the last of them had gone, Ellie turned to her. "It's done," he said quietly. Clara looked at him. This man who'd ridden into a storm, who'd been beaten and burned and betrayed, who'd come back when anyone else would have kept running. "Yeah," she said. "It is." They spent that night in the stable, their stable, the one they'd left behind. Someone had cleaned the threatening message from the wall. Someone had brought fresh hay for the gray mare, and someone, Clara suspected Mrs. Hayes had left a basket of food by the door. They ate in silence, sitting on the floor, the lantern casting soft shadows around them. What happens now? Clara asked finally. Illy looked at the rafters, thinking, I don't know. The land reverts to me, I suppose. The town too, technically. But I don't want to be some kind of, he gestured vaguely, lord over everyone. That's not what my father wanted. What did he want? He wanted a place where people could build lives, where they could raise families, work hard, prosper, where everyone had a fair chance. Illy looked at her. I think that's what I want too. Sounds nice. But it's going to take work. Going to take time. Going to take... He paused. It's going to take people who believe in it.
Clara smiled. I believe in it. Yeah. She leaned against his shoulder. Besides, someone's gotta make sure you don't do anything stupid.
Illy laughed, really laughed, the sound warm and genuine. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything, for saving me, for staying, for believing in me when nobody else did.
You'd have done the same for me, in a heartbeat.
They sat there as the night deepened, listening to the sounds of the town settling around them. And for the first time since Illy had ridden into Copper Bend, bloody and half dead, the future felt like something real, something possible, something worth fighting for. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain, not the violent storm that had brought them together, but something gentler, something that smelled like new beginnings. And inside the stable, as Clara closed her eyes and let herself rest against Illy's shoulder, she felt it. Peace, not the kind that comes from running or hiding, but the kind that comes from standing your ground, from facing the truth, from building something that might just last. The winter came slow and settled soft. Clara woke one morning to find the world blanketed in white, snow drifting down in lazy spirals, covering the scars town had worn like badges of shame. She stood in the doorway of the stable, though it wasn't really a stable anymore, not since Illy had started rebuilding it into something more, and watched the snow transform everything. The burned ground where the old barn had stood was hidden now, smooth and white and clean. The street where men had drawn guns and spoken lies was quiet, peaceful, marked only by the tracks of early risers heading to work. Even the iron bell in the square looked different, gentler somehow, its edges softened by snow. Beautiful, isn't it? Clara turned to find Illy behind her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. Real coffee this time, not the weak, twice boiled kind they'd survived on before. He handed her one, and she wrapped her cold fingers around it, breathing in the steam. Yeah, she said, feels like a different place. It is a different place. Illy stood beside her, looking out at the town, or it's trying to be. He was right. In the 3 months since that day in the square, since Garrett's confession and arrest, Copper Bend had begun to change, slowly, like a man learning to walk again after a long sickness. But changing. The first thing Illy had done was return the stolen land, not kept it, not parceled it out for profit, but given it back, to the families who'd worked it, to the people who'd built their lives on it in good faith, not knowing it was built on lies. Some had protested, said it was his by right, but he'd been firm. My father wanted people to prosper. He'd said, not owe him, just live. The second thing he'd done was open the water rights. The creek that ran through what had been Mercer land now flowed free for anyone who needed it. Cattle drank from it. Gardens grew beside it. Children played in it when the weather was warm. And the third thing, the thing that had surprised Clara most, was that he'd started building, not a mansion, not some monument to himself or his father, just a barn. A good one, sturdy and plain, big enough to shelter horses and store hay, and provide a place for travelers passing through to rest for the night. He'd built it on the same ground where the old one had burned, and he'd built it with his own hands, refusing help at first until the town had simply shown up one morning with lumber and nails, and the quiet determination of people trying to make amends. Clara had watched them work, men and women who'd once looked through her like she was invisible, now working alongside Illy, their faces set with purpose. Mrs. Hayes had brought food. The blacksmith had donated iron for the hinges. Even the children had helped, carrying water and holding boards steady while their fathers hammered. It had taken 6 weeks, and when it was finished, Illy had stood back and looked at it, this simple, honest structure, and nodded once. "It's good," he'd said, and it was. Now, as Clara sipped her coffee and watched the snow fall, she heard sounds from inside the barn. The soft shuffle of hooves, the rustle of hay. They had 6 horses now. The gray mare, of course, who'd carried them through everything and seemed content to spend her remaining years in comfort. 2 draft horses someone had donated when they couldn't afford to feed them anymore. And 3 others, strays, abandoned, too old or too worn to be useful anywhere else. Illy had taken that all, someone's gotta, he'd said when Clara asked why, and we've got the room. She'd smiled at that. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like she'd always belonged here, always been part of whatever he was building, and maybe she had. Clara finished her coffee and went inside, pulling her shawl. A real one now, wool and warm, a gift from Mrs. Hayes, tighter around her shoulders. The barn was warmer than outside, heat rising from the animals and the thick walls. She made her way to the gray mare's stall and ran her hand along the horse's neck. "Morning, girl," she murmured. The mare nickered softly, leaning into her touch. Clara had learned a lot in 3 months. How to properly brush a horse, how to check hooves for stones, how to measure feed and clean stalls and read the subtle signs that told you when an animal was content or troubled. Illy had taught her patiently, never making her feel stupid for not knowing, always encouraging. "You're good with them," he'd said one day, watching her work. "You think, I know." He'd smiled. "My father used to say horses can tell when someone has a kind heart. They trust you, Clara. That means something." She'd carried those words with her like a treasure. Now, as she worked through the morning routine, feeding, watering, mucking out stalls, she found herself humming. It was a tune Hank still played sometimes in the evenings, that same mournful harmonica song, though it sounded different now. Lonely, more like memory than grief. The barn door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and cold air. Clara looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, all weathered, hat in his hands. "Help you?" Clara asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The man shifted uncomfortably, looking for Illy Mercer. "Heard he might have work. He's up at the house, I can fetch him. Appreciate it." Clara found Illy in what had been the old foreman's cabin, a small structure he'd repaired and claimed as his own rather than trying to rebuild the grand house his father had lost. He was at a rough, hewn table, bent over papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Someone here to see you," Clara said, looking for work. Illy looked up, rubbing his eyes. "Who is it?" Didn't give his name. "Looks like he's been on the road a while." Illy nodded and stood, following her back to the barn. The man was still waiting, and when Illy appeared, something in his posture straightened. "Mr. Mercer," the man said. "Name's William Cross. Heard you might be hiring hands. I can work cattle, mend fences, whatever needs doing. I'm strong, I don't complain, and I don't drink more than I should." Illy studied him. "You know who I am, what happened here, I know. And you want to work for me anyway." Cross met his eyes. "I heard you gave land back instead of keeping it. Heard you opened the water to everyone. Heard you took in horses nobody else wanted." He paused, figured a man like that might be worth working for. Illy was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. "Welcome to Copper Bend, Mr. Cross. When can you start?" "Now, if you'll have me." They shook, and Clara saw the relief flash across Cross's face. As Illy showed him around, explaining the work and the pay, fair pay, Clara had learned more than most ranch hands saw. She felt something warm settle in her chest. This was what Illy was building. Not just a barn or a business. Something bigger. A place where people could start over. Where the past didn't have to be a chain around your neck. A place where people could be seen. The days grew longer as winter began to loosen its grip. Snow melted into mud, and mud dried into earth. And one morning, Clara woke to find first green shoots pushing up through the ground behind the barn. She knelt beside them, touching the tender leaves with gentle fingers. "Wildflowers," Illy said, coming up behind her. "My mother planted them years ago. Thought they were gone. They were just waiting," Clara said softly. Illy crouched beside her, and together they watched the small miracle of growth. Around them, the town was waking. smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer ringing out, children laughing as they ran through the muddy streets. "You ever think about before," Clara asked, "about what it was like when you were young, when your parents were alive?" "Sometimes." Illy picked a small stone from the dirt, turning it over in his fingers. "But I try not to live there." "That was a different life, a different me. Do you miss it, parts of it?" He looked at her. "But I wouldn't trade what I have now, not for anything." Clara felt her cheeks warm, even though it's been hard. "Especially because it's been hard." Illy stood, offering her his hand. She took it, and he pulled her to her feet. "Easy things don't mean much. But this." He gestured to the barn, to the town, to the green shoots pushing through the earth. "This we built. This we earned. That means something." Clara nodded, understanding. They walked together toward the barn, and Clara saw that Cross wasn't alone anymore. 2 more men had arrived, and a woman too, leading a tired horse. All of them looking for work, for a chance, for a place to belong. And Illy welcomed them all. By the time spring arrived in full, Copper Bend looked nothing like the dying town Clara had first known. The streets were cleaner. The buildings had fresh paint. Gardens sprouted in yards that had been barren for years, and the stable, the barn, had become something of a gathering place. People came to board there. Horses, yes, but they also came to talk, to share news, to sit on the benches Illy had built outside and watch the sunset. They came because they felt welcome, because Illy had made it clear that everyone was, even Garrett. The former sheriff was still in jail, awaiting trial in the county seat. Illy visited him once a week, bringing food, asking if he needed anything. Clara had asked him once why he bothered. "Because someone has to." Illy had said simply, "Because hate only breeds more hate, and I'm tired of hating." It was the kind of answer that made Clara love him more, though she hadn't quite found the courage to say those words out loud yet. One evening, as they sat outside the barn watching fireflies blink in the growing darkness, Illy turned to her. "I've been thinking," he said. About you." Clara's heart skipped. "What about me? About how you never had a real home, a real place." He was quiet for a moment. "And I was thinking maybe you'd want one, here with me." Clara stared at him, not quite believing what she was hearing. "I know I'm not much," Illy continued, his voice uncertain in a way she rarely heard. "And I know this place isn't fancy. But it's yours if you want it. You've earned it 100 times over." "Illy, you don't have to answer now. I just wanted you to know." He met her eyes. "I don't want you to stay because you think you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay because you want to. Because this feels like home." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She thought about the girl she'd been. Hungry, invisible, surviving day to day with no thought beyond the next meal, the next night. And she thought about who she was now. Strong, capable, valued, seen. All because of this man who'd ridden into a storm and refused to bow to the cruelty the world tried to make him accept. "It does feel like home," she said quietly. "It feels like the only home I've ever had." Illy smiled, and it transformed his whole face, made him look young, hopeful, like maybe the weight he'd carried for 15 years had finally begun to lift. "Then stay," he said. "Please, I will." He reached for her hand, and she gave it to him. They sat there as the darkness deepened, as the fireflies danced, as the town settled into peaceful sleep around them. And Clara felt it, the certainty, the rightness, the sense of finally being exactly where she was meant to be. Summer came warm and golden. The wildflowers behind the barn bloomed in waves of color, purple and yellow and white, nodding in the breeze. Clara had planted more, carefully tending them, creating beds that would grow and spread and remind everyone that beauty could return even to burned ground. The barn expanded. They added a room, small but sturdy, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the valley. It was meant to be Clara's, but more often than not, she fell asleep in the main room, talking with Illy until her eyes grew heavy, and sleep claimed her where she sat. He never pushed, never asked for more than she was ready to give, just made sure she had a blanket, made sure she was warm, made sure she knew she was safe, and slowly, carefully, the distance between them grew smaller. One night, as they sat by the fire, A real fire now, in a real hearth Illy had built. Clara rested her head on his shoulder. He went still for a moment, then relaxed, his arm coming around her. "This okay?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," she whispered. "This is perfect." They stayed like that until the fire burned down to embers, until the night grew cold and Clara's eyes drifted closed. And when Illy carefully lifted her and carried her to the small room, laying her down on the bed and pulling the blanket over her, she smiled in her sleep. Safe, home, loved. By autumn the town had voted. Mrs. Hayes became the official sheriff, and the people chose a council to help govern. Men and women both, voted on fairly, transparently. Illy had been asked to serve, but he declined. "I'm not a politician," he'd said. "I'm just a man trying to build something good. Let someone else lead." But everyone knew that he was the heart of Copper Bend. Not its ruler, not its lord, but its conscience. The quiet reminder of what they could be if they tried. The trial happened in September. Garrett and his co-conspirators were found guilty. Not just of fraud, but of murder. The sentence was prison, long years, justice finally served. Illy attended the verdict but didn't speak to the press, didn't give speeches. Just nodded once when it was read, then rode home. "How do you feel?" Clara asked when he returned. He thought about it, empty. Not in a bad way, just, he searched for words. "Like I've been carrying something for so long that now that it's gone, I don't quite know what to do with my hands. You could use them for this." Clara held out a set of boots. His boots, the beautiful black ones with the silver spurs. She'd spent weeks cleaning them, polishing them, restoring them to their former glory. They gleamed in the afternoon light. Illy took them, his expression soft. "Clara, you didn't have to. I wanted to." She smiled. "They're part of your story, part of ours. They deserve to be remembered." He set them carefully on the shelf by the door. Not to wear, but to keep. A reminder of where they'd been, of what they'd survived, of how far they'd come. Winter came again, gentle this time, painting the world in soft whites and grays. And on Christmas Eve, as snow fell outside and the fire crackled warm, Clara stood in the barn wearing a dress Mrs. Hayes had helped her make, simple but lovely, the color of cream. Illy stood across from her in his best shirt, his hair combed back, his face clean, shaven. Between them stood a traveling preacher who'd agreed to perform the ceremony. Barn was full tounce, people crowded in, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces warm with joy. They'd become family, these people, not by blood, but by choice, by forgiveness, by deciding that the future mattered more than the past. The preacher spoke words about love and commitment, about building lives together, about the sacred promise of partnership. But Clara barely heard them. She was too busy looking at Illy, at the man who'd taught her what it meant to be brave, to stand tall, to refuse to let cruelty win. "Do you, Clara, win? Take this man." "I do," she said, not waiting for the question to finish. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Illy grinned, eager, always. "And do you, Illy Mercer, take this woman?" "I do." His voice was steady, certain, without question, without doubt. "Forever. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Illy cupped Clara's face in his hands and kissed her, gentle, reverent, full of promise. The barn erupted in cheers and applause, and when they finally pulled apart, both were smiling so wide it hurt. They walked out into the snow hand in hand, and the crowd followed, spilling into the street, where tables had been set up, where food and music waited, where celebration would last long into the night. But first, Clara and Illy stood together in the falling snow, watching the town they'd saved, the town that had saved them. "Happy?" Illy asked. "So happy I can barely breathe." He laughed and pulled her close, and they stood there as the snow covered everything. The scars, the memories, the pain. Covering it all in white, in possibility, in the promise of new beginnings. Spring returned as it always did. Clara woke one morning to birdsong and sunlight streaming through the window. She rose carefully, trying not to wake Illy, and stepped outside. The world was alive, green and growing, flowers blooming everywhere she looked. She walked barefoot through the grass, just as she had that first day when she'd been a hungry, invisible girl looking for shelter. But now grass was thick and soft. Now she wasn't hungry. Now she was seen. Now she was home. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Illy, sleepy-eyed and smiling, coming to join her. Couldn't sleep, he asked, didn't want to miss this. They stood together, watching the sun climb higher, watching the town come alive. Smoke rose from chimneys. Doors opened. Children ran laughing into the street. And in the distance, Clara could see the valley they'd once fled to, green and beautiful, waiting. You ever think about leaving? She asked, just riding out there and seeing what else is in the world. Sometimes, Illy admitted. But then I remember, he looked at the barn, at the town, at her. I remember that I already found everything I was looking for. Clara leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her, and together they watched Copper Bend live. Not perfectly, not without struggles or disagreements or the occasional difficulty, but honestly, with grace, with the kind of stubborn hope that refuses to let darkness win. Years passed. Barn grew. They added a house, a real one, modest but beautiful, with a porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. They added more horses, more land cultivated and shared. They added children, 2 girls who grew up fearless and kind, who learned to ride before they could properly walk, who understood from their earliest days that their parents had built something worth protecting. Clara taught them to see people, really see them, the way Illy had first seen her. Taught them that kindness wasn't weakness, that standing up for what was right mattered more than being comfortable, and Illy taught them to build, to work with their hands, to create things that would last, not just structures but relationships, communities, legacies of hope. Copper Bend prospered, not with gold or cattle or the things that had once defined success, but with people, with families who put down roots and stayed, with neighbors who helped each other, with a shared commitment to being better than they'd been before. The boots, those beautiful black boots with the silver spurs, stayed on their shelf. Clara polished them once a year, on the anniversary of the day Illy had ridden in that storm, and each time she did, she remembered being invisible, remembered being afraid, remembered pulling a stranger from the dust and not knowing that simple act of kindness would change everything. On a warm spring evening many years later, Clara and Illy sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren play in the meadow. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the world in color. The sun hung low and golden, casting long shadows. Clara's hair was gray now, her hands marked with the years of work. Illy's scar had faded to a pale line, and his hair had gone white. But his eyes were still the same, storm, gray and steady and kind. We built something good. Clara said softly, we did. Your father would be proud. Illy took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I think he would. But I'm more grateful that you're proud, that you're here. Where else would I be? I don't know. But I thank God every day that you stayed. Clara looked at him, this man who'd refused to bow, who'd stood for truth when it would have been easier to run, who'd taught her what it meant to have courage. I love you, she said. I don't think I say it enough. You show it every day. Illy lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. That's more than enough. They sat there as the sun set, as the children played, as the world turned golden and then amber and then soft purple. And when the first stars appeared, Clara rested her head on Illy's shoulder and closed her eyes. Content, complete, home. The story of the girl who cleaned the cowboy's boots became legend in Copper Bend, not the dramatic kind, full of exaggeration and impossible heroics, but the quiet kind, the true kind, the story of how kindness in a storm could change everything. The story of how standing for truth mattered more than comfort. The story of how the broken could be rebuilt, how the lost could be found, how the invisible could become the most important person in someone's world. And in the years that followed, when travelers passed through Copper Bend, they'd hear the story. They'd see the barn, the house, the meadow of wildflowers. They'd meet the descendants who still lived there, still worked the land, still welcomed strangers, and they'd understand.
that this wasn't a place of gold or glory. This was a place of grace, built by two people who'd refused to let cruelty win, who'd chosen each other when the world told them to choose survival, who'd built something that lasted, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And so Copper Bend lived on, not perfect, not without its struggles, but alive, growing, proof that even the smallest act of compassion, a girl pulling a stranger from a storm, could change the course of everything, could build a home, could build a family, could build a legacy that would outlive them all. And as the seasons turned and the years passed, the boots remained on their shelf, polished, preserved, a reminder of where it all began, of dust and storms and kindness, of grace given when it wasn't deserved, of love earned through standing firm, and of two souls who found each other in the darkness and built a light that would never go out, the end, but also the beginning, because that's what grace does. It doesn't end, it spreads, it grows, it becomes the story others tell, the hope others carry, the reason they believe that even in the hardest moments, even in the cruelest storms, kindness still matters, truth still wins, and love, real, stubborn, refusing to quit love, can build something beautiful from ash, something that lasts, something worth remembering forever.